So today's webinar, we are focused on the welcoming standard. This webinar series is intended to equip those who are ready to become certified welcoming with the information that they need to start their certification journey. So our last session covered the certification process, eligibility, timeline, and outcomes. And today's webinar is an in-depth look at the welcoming standard. We'll cover each of the 7 framework areas and understand how the STAR designation system works within each one. I'll share the big lifts and some examples of what it means to be compliant with the criteria in them. And then just as a reminder, today's webinar is the second in a 3-part series. The first webinar covered the basics of certified welcoming. And by signing up for today's webinar, you did sign up for the entire series. Next week's webinar is our office hours, which will be led by my colleague, Jenny Diaz, and that's on June 14th from 2 to 3 p.m. And this is an opportunity to drop in and ask questions specific to your community. You don't have to stay for the entire hour, and we encourage you to think about your questions in advance and stay for as long as you want. You will receive a recording of today's webinar, and you should have received a recording of the one 3 weeks ago. And if you didn't, please feel free to drop your email into the chat, and we'll make sure that you receive that recording as well. So just a few housekeeping items for us. Please keep your microphone muted to limit feedback, noise, and interruptions. Today's webinar is a little bit more technical in nature, so I'll pause along the way to see if you have any questions or have something that needs to be clarified. Feel free to also pop questions into the chat along the way, and we'll try to make sure that they either get answered in the chat or answered live. I've also linked a Google sheet of the standard for today's webinar in the presentation, and we'll pop that in the chat as well. Feel free to make a copy of this document. There's a link directly into it to take your own notes and follow along today. I do apologize, it is as a Google sheet. I know sometimes there might be some firewalls or barriers to folks, particularly who might be in local government, accessing it. So if you need an Excel document, pop your email in the chat and we'll make sure that you get that as well if you'd like to be able to download that as an Excel and follow along as well. And then again, this was being recorded, and we will make sure that you receive a link to the YouTube in a couple of days. Great. So I know a lot of you are already familiar with our organization, but just for those that might be less familiar, Welcoming America is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that leads a movement of inclusive communities becoming more prosperous by ensuring everyone belongs. We believe that all people, including immigrants, are valued contributors and vital to the success of our communities and shared future. Chief among our flagship programs is the Welcoming Network, where we have over 320 members, both from the local government and the nonprofit sector. Members receive a variety of benefits, including discounts to certified welcoming. We talked a lot about membership in our last webinar, and so if you're not yet a member, we still encourage you to apply today. All right. So really excited to cover the welcoming standard in detail with all of you today. The standard is used to define a welcoming community by laying out the policies, practices, and programs through these 7 different framework areas. It's also the backbone to the certified welcoming program. So before we really get into the nitty-gritty of reviewing all of the different criteria of the standard, I just want to take a moment to share a little bit about different language and expectations within the welcoming standard. So first is around populations and status. So I just want to note that there's a general expectation that we meet more than one status and racial, ethnic, language group to be served. So for example, we shouldn't only be providing language access in Spanish, but should be making sure that language access is available for all language groups. So when you're thinking about applying specific criteria, you should be thinking about multiple immigrant groups, multiple statuses, as well. So again, thinking about maybe not just a refugee population, but also thinking about how do we ensure that services are available to, say, an undocumented immigrant as well. To talk about jurisdiction a little bit, we often get questions around, well, this isn't under our jurisdiction in the local government, for example, with education, right? Most commonly, school districts are not under the local government's jurisdiction. And we do actually still require those criteria to be compliant. And so we think that we have calibrated it in a way to ensure that those items are still able to be compliant, and really understanding that the standard looks holistically at a community. And so those criteria should still be compliant. And so we have that, with education, with law enforcement, safe communities as well, where there might be a few pieces that aren't under the jurisdiction and yet are still being required to be certified. Along with that, want to make a note about the way that language is phrased in the welcoming standard, because we do see it as a collaborative and holistic approach to welcoming and immigrant inclusion. And so with that, we have tried to really clarify, and I think much more in this updated standard than in our previous version, around when we would allow a criteria to be considered compliant through a partnership or through a program that's not through the local government. So for example, when any time that it says programs, when the criteria says programs do something, then that could be a nonprofit organization. It could be another entity. It does not have to be a program that is run by the local government. Alternatively, when it states specifically the local government, then that means that the local government must be the one doing the work. So we've really tried to clarify this in the language in this updated version of the standard. One other piece that I want to mention in the standard, and when you read it, is the word immigrant. Immigrant is meant in this case to be very inclusive and encompassing. So it will include immigrants, refugees, international students. So this is the very broad and non-technical definition of immigrants, and people who might not be, have that status, might be non-immigrants. When you look under, the technical definition, it'll be asylee seekers, all of those folks who are basically not born here. But then it also actually includes children of immigrants as well. So we couldn't write all of that out. We actually have another version of the standard coming out in more of like a toolbook format that'll be coming out later this year. And that will include some of that glossary as well. But as those of you who are getting started with certification, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that it's a very broad use of the word. And then before we get into all of the criteria, I want to talk about moving through the STAR designations. I recognize that welcoming and immigrant inclusion work isn't typically linear. Sometimes we might be doing things that are in the 5-star criteria, but we have tried our best to really think about certification and the STAR designations as building blocks. And so for the most part, we think that, the 1-star is really meant to be the foundation of a welcoming community. This really helps to ensure that there's that baseline of infrastructure and some guardrails around the welcoming work. 2-star is about engaging the local community. So it really builds on the foundation of what we've seen here from the local government in the 1-star. And we're really starting to do more community outreach and really being more intentional thinking about equity and immigrant inclusion. 3-star, here we're starting to really think about institutionalizing work through policy and leadership as well. So 3-star, I would say, becomes really increasingly difficult from that 1 to 2-star. I think there's a little bit more of a jump. And in part because of some of the criteria that we have around language access and civic engagement as being the typical big lifts. So after we focused on local government, again, for 3-star, 4-star goes back to thinking about the entire community again, and also strategy and evaluation. So here what we see as the big lift is typically community planning process or strategy setting for immigrant inclusion. But again, beyond just the local government itself, and really thinking about those community partners that were built in the 2-star phase. And then finally, 5-star. The expectation here is that the commitment is not only the local community and local government, but that there's other partners in this work as well. And sometimes they might be harder to engage. And so we're thinking about the private sector, employers, thinking about other jurisdictions. How is this work regionally applied? And what are those partnerships like? And then also really thinking about the state level. And so recognizing that sometimes there are different states that are more difficult to be doing this type of work. Our goal with the certified welcoming and the welcoming standard is that no matter what state you live in, you are able to apply this work and that you are able to be compliant with all of the criteria in the welcoming standard from 1 to 5 stars. But I do want to recognize that in some states, it might be more difficult and harder to do. And take just one moment just to quick look in the chat. Okay, looks like everything's good there. All right, I'm also going to be bouncing between both my slideshow and then that Google sheet that was shared in the chat by Jenny. And so just want to recognize that it's going to be a little bumping in some of the transitions, and just thank you for your patience as we move along. And then again, this is going to be probably a little bit more technical, so please feel free to stop, ask questions, and we will pause after each framework area to move through them as well. So we're going to start with the civic engagement. And here we have, as our framework area goal, thinking about how all residents, including immigrants, can fully participate in civic life by increasing access to leadership and democratic spaces. And I see there's that request to put that in the chat again. So Jenny, could you put that Google Doc in the chat again? Would you mind? We will. But I'm going to have to just bob over here. So I'm going to scroll down to civic engagement. And let me know if anyone has any difficulty accessing it. So here we're going to just kind of chat through each of these criteria and talk about some examples and things like that. So the first one in 1 star is that, that there's programs. So again, this doesn't have to be your local government, but it could be a community partner in supporting immigrants to obtain their U.S. citizenship. So we're thinking about naturalization type programs here. The expectation is to be beyond showing up to a naturalization ceremony, but really thinking about supporting through the process. So things like classes, supporting with the application. Lots of times folks have a naturalization type clinic, fee waivers, and that type of program. 2-star for civic engagement. Here we have criteria around supporting eligible immigrants in voting. The expectation here is to go beyond registering someone to vote, but thinking about engaging in elections. And as we have a big election year coming up next year with our presidential election, I'm sure a lot of folks are really thinking about this, both with get out the vote and really ensuring that people are showing up. But this also might be, more localized. And so it could be something around hosting a forum with candidates at maybe an immigrant-led community-based organization. And so really thinking about, how do we ensure that folks have that opportunity to have their priorities heard to those candidates, and ensuring that they're thinking about the immigrant community as their constituents as they are. I want to note here also, before moving on to 3-star, you'll see there's only 1 criteria in the 1-star, only 1 criteria in the 2-star. We did really try to think about, as you'll see, and as we move to other framework areas, they might have more in 1-star and more in 2-star. So we did really try to think about making sure that it was balanced and that there's not too many criteria in one of each of the framework areas. On average, for each star designation, there's about 20. 1-star has a little fewer, and I think some of the other ones have a little bit more. 1-star is just 16. But just want to note that as we continue to move along. So here for the 3-star in civic engagement, this is actually our big lift for the civic engagement. Typically, each of the framework areas will have like one big lift. And this is one around leadership and civic development. So for these 3 criteria, there's one around supporting immigrants and developing civic leadership skills, one about connecting immigrants with local government departments and community resources, and another about making sure that the criteria 3.1 is accessible to speakers of languages other than English. This could be one program, or it could be different types of programs. So, the first one is really around that leadership and civic development. Oftentimes we'll see this run out of a nonprofit organization. But also 3.1, typically what we have often seen, but is not required to be, is like a My City Academy or a natural helper type program. The goal for this criteria is to ensure that immigrants can navigate these programs and also empower them to help other individuals access them as well. For 3.2, I'm thinking about accessibility for multiple languages. We have tried to ensure that language access is built throughout the entire standards. We do have some very explicit criteria around like a language access policy and training for your local government. But then we also have it woven in other types of ways that we think it's really important to call out, particularly because I think we have seen programs for CE 3.0 and 3.1 that are, oh yeah, well, it's available to everybody, but then are not really thinking about that intentionality to ensure that the program is accessible. Or they'll have, a neighborhood leadership institute that's citywide, but only have a few like really long-term, fully established, highly English proficient participants in the programs. So with this aspect around being accessible to speakers of languages other than English, I just want to mention, it could be something where the program is run fully in another language. It could be that interpretation is provided, but it could also be something where the program is very intentionally designed with perhaps an ESL instructor and really thinking about a process that's similar to designing a contextualized ESL class. And so there might be some co-teaching with an ESL instructor or some other types of program design that could be there as well. We're going to move on to 4-star. So the first, some more of that, civic leadership development with youth programs. And then the next 2 are really thinking about public hearings and meetings. I want to mention here, so the first one is addressing barriers to immigrant participation, and then 4.2 is addressing language access needs. We decided when developing the standard that we wanted to name language access separately because there's other barriers that should be considered, and not only language access there's other barriers than language access. And also want to recognize again, thinking about how do we have the standard build upon itself, that programs from your 3-star will likely have led people to be introduced to some of these things, like public hearings and meetings, into your 4-star. Should also hopefully have identified those barriers, perhaps through your program in the 3-star, and then be able to identify those gaps and improve them. Here is in 5-star, I'm going to keep moving. Just want to name for 5.0, where it says participation, what we mean here is serving, right? But just want to make that distinction as far as a language change, that in 4.1, we're talking about, perhaps going and speaking or testifying at your local city council meeting. And then 5.0 and 5.1 really means, serving on that council or mayoral appointed board or commission for both 5.0 and 5.1. So again, addressing those needs, addressing those barriers, including language access. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're starting to think about the state or engaging other jurisdictions here in the 5-star level as well. So the reason for 5.2, I just want to mention this, is programs engage state and or local election offices, is simply because of how that can vary across the states. Our goal here is to increase access to elections and to ensure that there continue to be all of the services and programs available despite language. And then the last one, 5.3, accessing and using data. Just want to mention, again, that this could perhaps be a part of that program in your 3-star civic leadership piece. But might be like a higher component of it, or perhaps another layer of it. And also recognize part of the reason that we included this in the standard, certainly the local government, is required to share all kinds of information and data through its sunshine laws. But oftentimes, requesting it or accessing data can be cumbersome. And so making sure that people have the ability to use that information, access it, and advocate for themselves throughout it is part of our goal with that one. So I'm going to take a pause here on civic engagement before we move on to connected communities. Are there any questions or things that I can clarify for folks before moving on? Nope. Great. Well, just going to go ahead and move on here. I'm just going to keep it here and not on the full screen. Well, maybe I still will. Let's see if it works correctly. Oh, it does. Great. Okay. So for connected communities, our goal here is around supporting residents and building their personal capacity to engage with people different from themselves on equal footing and in sustained ways. I think this is the framework area that Welcoming America is typically most recognized for, since it's built on building connections, trust, and authentic relationships between residents. I also think it's actually one of the more difficult framework areas. I think folks often think of it as an easier lift, such as like festivals and dinners and dialogues. But I think as we review it, you'll see how when you move from 1 to 5 stars, you'll see the transition from early engagement to sustained practice. And one of the things that I think is really important is this language around equal footing. I think oftentimes what we've seen for a lot of programs has been on more of like a service type model. And so one of the things that's really important around social engagement theory is the aspect of ensuring that there's equal footing between individuals. So we're going to move to connected communities, and apologies, this spreadsheet's not in alphabetical order, but the way that we're moving through the framework areas is, so might just have to bop around on the spreadsheet a little bit. So the first one here that I just want to mention, the first 1-star area is a little bit more of some of the guardrails that we put in place for certified welcoming, and also some expectations around the local government as we think about building relationships and trust, and really setting out expectations and building that foundation for a 1-star. So those guardrails are that the local government, and this is referring to leadership, is not making public statements discouraging immigration or immigrant inclusion. Another one is that there's ongoing public communication from the local government about welcoming and about its commitment. And another one of the guardrails is to not make public statements directly attacking individuals or groups on basically the protected classes here. And I think there had been a question on our previous webinar about what if it's a comment or discrimination based on a different status or protected class? And so this is our guardrail around that. It's really recognizing, intersectionality of all of this work, And we would still expect that there would be the protection of people's rights, even if they're not an immigrant as well. And then the last one is that the local government participates in celebrations of immigrant cultures, customs, and beliefs. So this isn't that the local government is hosting the activities, but instead that, they're being invited, and that someone is coming to those events as well. So to move to 2-star, we are now really starting to think about building these relationships. So this is beyond that showing up because I'm invited, and really thinking about that intentionally bringing immigrants and non-immigrants together. This is where we'll see more of the dinners and the dialogues and those types of events, typically a lot of welcoming week activities as well. And these are typically early engagement type of activities. And then you'll see that we have some more sustained criteria here. We have one about arts and creative placemaking. So beginning to think about how people see themselves represented in public spaces. And then the CC 2.2, that community of efforts advancing this work is connected to the larger equity in the community. So I just want to recognize that oftentimes immigrant inclusion is siloed from racial equity, and yet many immigrants in the United States are people of color and have very racialized experiences in the US. And so we want to ensure that the work is happening that's part of a larger equity ecosystem. And so conversations around police brutality and police reform should not exclude immigrants either. And really thinking about how do we ensure that the very real and historical and current experiences of Black African Americans, and that those are being addressed while also recognizing that there are very real and disparate outcomes on immigrants as they interact with the police as well. And so thinking about how do we have these conversations together as a larger community, and ensure that that intersection is being addressed. So that's it for 2-star. Now we have a little bit of a break for 3-star. We just have one criteria here, which is that the local government's equity work is also including immigrant inclusion. So again, the goal that the equity work is not siloed and to really understand how immigration and race are intersecting. So for here, we might see some disparity studies, how there might be some police policies that have been changed that have benefited both immigrants and Black residents, for example. But the goal here is to ensure that the local government is also thinking about it here. So in the 2-star, we're thinking about perhaps some community efforts that are thinking around ensuring that this work is not siloed. And then in the 3-star, we're moving to a more institutionalized approach. And sorry, scroll down just a little bit. Okay, so we're going to move on to 4-star for connected communities. So here we have programs that serve diverse immigrant and non-immigrant residents, embed strategies to build relationships between immigrant and non-immigrant residents. So here, quite honestly, this might not look like typical evidence. We're thinking more about program design and strategies that are embedded in programs, and that they're programs that probably already exist. So it might be that a community meeting alternates with English and Spanish simultaneous interpretation. It could be a community gardening program where it's featuring vegetable sharing from residents with backgrounds that are different from each other. And then the other 2 criteria are around addressing biases. We have one about addressing biases about others held by non-immigrant residents, and then we have one about addressing biases about others held by immigrant residences. These are broken apart because we recognize that the strategies will likely be different. And then similar to our other criteria at the very beginning, when thinking about the biases, we should be referring back primarily to thinking about those in a protected class. want to mention also here that when thinking about that civic engagement program that was in 3-star, you could be thinking ahead to your 4-star criteria and maybe some of that bias. For this one for 4.2, you could include some of that like anti-bias work or training, thinking about some of that within your civic engagement programs. And then all the way up to 5-star. So we have one, which is around the local government accommodating diverse cultural and religious practices in its daily operation. So this would be things like dress code and holiday recognition. And then with 5.1, programs, resource initiatives that bring immigrant and non-immigrant residents together to identify and work on common interests or challenges. And so this is very similar. So 5.1 is very similar to 4.0. But just want to recognize that this word here, resource initiatives, is really what we're thinking about. And so, again, requiring these types of programs that typically, maybe immigrants and non-immigrants are already coming together around, but being really intentional about how they build relationships and how they're resourced. So ultimately what we're looking for is a long-term investment in bridge building and community, and that there's someone who is investing in social cohesion in the community, and that those strategies are research-based. Okay, so similarly, I'm going to take a pause here and see if anyone has any questions specifically for connected communities.
There's no questions about connected communities, but there's a question about when you would need to start the process. So I just wanted to note that if you are being recertified under the STAR designation, there is a deadline for you to meet, which is based off of your initial certification. And Melissa, Madi, and I can have a conversation with you about when your deadline is, when your initial certificate expires. And then for everyone else, if this is your initial certification, you need to complete the process within the timeline based on the STAR designation that you are seeking. So like previously mentioned, it could take you from anywhere from 6 months to a year to complete it, additional 6 months after the audit and report, where you have a chance to submit some more evidence. So it just kind of depends on the STAR designation you're seeking, and also whether you're doing recertification or if you're doing certification, recertification or your initial certification. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jenny, for answering that question. All right. Well, I know that this is a lot of information coming at you all at once, which is why we have our office hours set up for next week as well. So just another quick plug on that. And we'll move on to the next framework area, which is economic development. So here we have workforce and economic development infrastructure addressing the priorities and needs of immigrant residents and immigrant job seekers. So economic development is thinking both about workforce as well as business development, small business, large business, entrepreneurship, and so on. I'm just going to hop on over here. So for 1-star, programs supporting immigrant job seekers and finding and obtaining employment. So just want to recognize that these programs do not have to be through the local government, and they could be the nonprofit, the refugee resettlement agency, et cetera. And I would say it's pretty kind of like your basic, it might be like your job and family services, or it might be your refugee resettlement agency. Typically, in a lot of places that are only 1-star, what I would expect is that there's not a lot of additional programming or support outside of some of your mainstream programs that already exist, but that they are accessible, right? That there is language access and that there is support for folks to be able to utilize those services. And then 1.1, supporting immigrant business owners in starting, sustaining, or growing their businesses. So again, your basic economic development services, they don't have to be through the local government, but we do expect to see intention in reaching immigrant residents. But again, a lot of most folks, most cities, and counties have some type of business development program or service or support. Sometimes it might just be, your small business development center. Perhaps you have a minority business development center, those programs that are funded through the state. Those will often meet it, but there needs to be some ability to demonstrate that intention in reaching your immigrant residents as well. For 2.0, we have programs supporting immigrant adults in accessing additional education to obtain the skills and degrees required to meet their employment goals. Typically, we'll see a community college filling this in a lot of places. If you don't have a community college, sometimes it'll be met, perhaps by a nonprofit partner or even a university, but really thinking about filling some of those gaps between whether it be English or perhaps a credential or other types of support to help get people into the job and labor market. And then we have addressing barriers for immigrant entrepreneurs and business owners. And so, we're moving a little bit here from that 1.1 supporting immigrant business owners to now being able to identify what those barriers are and being able to address them. So typically here, some of those typical SBDCs, or sometimes SCORE is often another typical economic development partner. Sometimes they're not really going to be able to have those skill set on staff or within their volunteer base to really be the ones to be addressing these barriers. And so just want to note that here, that's where that kind of like step up is from that 1 to that 2-star piece. I also want to mention, the words here, it's typically in 1-star is starting, sustaining, or growing. Accessing capital is actually at a higher star as well. So just want to mention that here for 1-star piece. All right, so I'm going to move on over to 3-star. This is actually 3.0 is one of my new favorite criteria in the standard. And so it's that local workforce agencies have information on current and projected demographic trends of the local immigrant population and the unique barriers faced by immigrant job seekers. I think that I can speak for our whole certification team. Our conversations that we've had with workforce boards through our pilots of the new standard were some of our best conversations. And so just really thinking about, ensuring that the workforce boards who are responsible for the funding of so many programs in a community are equipped with the demographic information about the immigrant population, including, what types of jobs and skills did people have before they came to the United States, and how do we ensure that there's opportunity to match that here as well, and how those, what kind of barriers might be able to be addressed as well. So, like I said, really excited about that new criteria of really thinking about the important role that workforce agencies have and ensuring that they have the information that they need. And then the next one is around supporting immigrant job seekers and communicating their work experience and skills for U.S. employers. So again, just, recognizing that folks who have foreign education and talent and skill set and experience that they bring with them from their home country, and if they have that opportunity to utilize it here and share it with others. And sometimes that'll look like, detailed resume assistance. Sometimes it might be through a refugee resettlement agency or through a nonprofit partner that's providing some of that more detailed assistance with folks. I'm going to move on to 4-star, which is around supporting immigrants in meeting occupational certification and or credentialing requirements. Again, this is typically or often met through a community college. We'd also be thinking about maybe some contextualized English classes or other programs that follow good practice. And then here in 4.1, very similar to that 1.1, but now we're really thinking about access to capital. So programs support immigrant business owners in accessing capital to start, support, or sustain their business. And recognizing that access to capital is such a barrier for so many small and disadvantaged businesses in the United States. So all the way up to 5-star, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation today, we are really thinking about engaging that state and the private sector here within economic development. So here we have occupational licensing and working with state agencies on addressing some of those barriers, working with employers to build welcoming work environments, working with employers to identify and address barriers to hiring immigrant job seekers, and working with employers and immigrant employees to identify and address barriers to retaining immigrant staff. I want to mention here when thinking about that evidence to collect for these 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3, that the expectation that is not that employers have good practice. I think that we probably all live in communities where there might be 1 or 2 good employers, where that are typically like really hiring a lot of immigrants or refugees, and they're well known, but we're not auditing individual employers. We're really looking at a program that would bring employers together to work on these things. So some examples of that might look like a roundtable, perhaps through a chamber of commerce that brings, HR professionals from different companies together to talk about some of these things. We've also seen a roundtable that brought immigrant employees together with the employer to talk about this aspect specifically about retaining immigrant staff and professional development and opportunity to advance within an organization as well. And then the last one within 5-star is addressing barriers to local government procurement and contracting opportunities, recognizing that government contracts and procurement is a really, really large opportunity, and something that I'm actually passionate about as well. And so what kinds of programs does your local government have to ensure that those barriers, particularly for immigrants, are removed, and recognizing that, a lot of the data that is tracked are around minority businesses. And so how do you ensure that that's also being applied to immigrant businesses? So I'm going to take a pause here for economic development before we move on. All right, we're going to move on to education. Get my slide to advance. There we go. Okay, so here we have our goal that all students from from early childhood through adulthood have the support they need to succeed in school and the education they need to succeed in the workforce. So this is a framework area that looks at K through 12. Actually, early childhood education and care is also included all the way up through adulthood. So it's the whole spectrum, cradle to grave, basically, of education. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, education is one of the framework areas that we receive a lot of questions about. That the schools aren't under the local government's jurisdiction. But if there's a large private charter school that's serving a large immigrant population, feel free to include that in your information as well. So we're going to scoot on over to our education framework area in the document and move through the STAR designations. So for 1 star, what we're really looking at here is knowing what barriers are to families navigating your local K-12 school system. So some places might have really clear neighborhood schools and others might have more of a choice within a district. Our primary focus for this 1.0 is on enrollment and connecting to staff within the school district. This information about schools for 1.1 is that it should be provided in language, right? Or that there's language access for families that are going through the process of enrolling and navigating the school system, or when they have a question about the district. And then for adult education here, we're thinking about, adult English language classes. Sorry, it's a tongue twister for me. So what we're thinking about here, as with all of the criteria that ask about barriers, the barriers should be specific to your community, but they typically might be like the time of day, transportation, childcare, and so on. For 2 star, thinking about family engagement strategies, all schools have some type of family engagement program. And so we know from research how important it is and how much of that has an impact on a student's outcome in school and their success in school. And so we're wanting to make sure that that there are programs to support that. I want to mention here, I didn't include this in the first, in that language slide, and I realize now that I should have. We have programs here, and then local K-12 school districts, right? So there's a bit of a shift here in thinking about who is providing that service, right? So this one here for 2.0, supporting immigrant family engagement, that could actually be from a nonprofit community partner. It does not have to be from the school district, but here for your 1.1, local K-12 school districts provide language accessible information. That one is, the requirement is on the school district. They're mandated by federal law to be providing language access. And of course, lots of things are mandated by federal law, and it doesn't mean that they're always done in good practice, but just recognizing that little tiny shift in language and thinking about, how you might think about fulfilling this criteria. So just wanted to take a pause there. Again, that programs can be very broad in thinking about who might fulfill that program. And so this might be a nonprofit that really thinks about, after school engagement, meeting families where they are outside of school. A more high bar might be like a home visiting program as well. And then here we have 2.1. Just want to note that this criteria is for high school students, right? So thinking about supporting high school students in accessing and understanding their higher education opportunities. It really should be beyond FAFSA nights that are for the whole school. And it should be beyond what is kind of typically or traditionally provided for all students. Should really be intentional about understanding the barriers that immigrant students face. And then 2.2, this addressing barriers to the adult education infrastructure. This is honestly likely to vary by locality. It's often covered by a community college working to create access to opportunities for immigrant students. But if there's not a community college, it might be through a nonprofit or a university as well. For 3-star, we have the professional development, which, all schools are required to provide professional development to their staff and teachers. And so this one's here around teaching and supporting diverse student populations, including immigrant students. This doesn't have to be one that is necessarily required for all staff. Typically, it's going to be required perhaps for those English and language arts teachers. We certainly appreciate those that require it for all, but recognize that that's not where a lot of schools have the entire ability to mandate some of those pieces when they have some other trainings that are required as well. I do want to lift up one example. I can't remember the locality where it was from, but they actually provided some training to school bus drivers and cafeteria workers as well, which I thought was a really nice touch on recognizing all of the different staff that interact and touch on different immigrant students throughout their school day. For 3.1 is career technical education. So this is a high school program. I just want to recognize, all districts are federally required to have career technical education, but it likely looks different in implementation. And so what we're really looking at here is recruitment and admissions process to ensure that there aren't any undue barriers. Sometimes places require there to be an additional application to enter the CTE program, or perhaps the recruitment process is just, word of mouth. And so really thinking about how do we ensure that CTE programs are truly accessible and are reaching everybody. And then for 3.2, K through 12 schools supporting immigrant students that have limited or interrupted formal education to attain their educational goals, right? So our SLIFE programs. Just wanting to ensure that these are appropriate for the students, and so that SLIFE programs are not, isolating older students, so that they still have the opportunity to finish their high school career as they choose. And then last on here for the 3-star is providing contextualized English classes for adult English learners. So, a lot of early literacy English classes might be really focused on that basic vocabulary, basic vocabulary. But thinking about now that application within context. And so maybe it is, more career focused. And so having those contextualized English classes being available as well. We're going to move on up to 4-star for education, which is the first one, having an opportunity to collect feedback from immigrant families on the school environment. And then an expectation here as well, right, that they're collecting that feedback, but also utilizing it to improve the welcoming environment at the local school. Also recognizing, I think many schools, perhaps all, do collect some type of feedback from students. And so, and their families. And so how is that being disaggregated and considered based on immigrant backgrounds as well? 4.1, programs address barriers to participation in family engagement programs for immigrant families. So similar to 2-star, we had supporting immigrant family engagement in education. And now this one is on addressing barriers to those family engagement programs. So, what programs are working, what are not, what needs to be changed to address those barriers. And then programs addressing barriers to early childhood education and care for immigrant children. And as a mother of young children, I'm really excited to see early childhood education and care in our standard, in our updated standard. And just want to, put emphasis on the fact that care is included in the standard. So this recognizes that many families use more informal care arrangements, right? More of maybe a babysitter or a friend or another family member. And so how can those caregivers be supported to ensure developmentally appropriate education is integrated into their care? So we've seen some really cool programs, that have like a text and an app that provide, some really simple suggestions around activities that people can do. with their children, and having those in different languages as well. And then education, the early childhood education obviously is more in a formal daycare type setting. Then moving on up to 5-star. So this one here, 5.0, K through 12 schools accommodate diverse cultural and religious practices in their daily operations. This is very similar to another criteria that we have in government and community leadership, which is that the it might be a dress code, it might be holidays off. And so as an example, New York City recognizes Eid for their school district. For 5.1, mental health services are also specifically named in equitable access. But I want to mention here that we did also decide to include them here for education around immigrant students, simply because we recognize that mental health is a major health crisis for our youth today. And we wanted to be very explicit about having access to services for young students as well. Sometimes that might be overlooked when it's just mental health services as a whole. So we wanted to name it specifically. And then we have here, in the 5-star, engaging the state. So adult education, it could be multiple agencies that are engaged, and this will vary by the state as well. And honestly, funding is often a main outcome here. And then the final criteria in this section is around early childhood education and care, engaging the state government on expanding that access. And funding and advocacy are typically the main expectations for this criteria. I just want to recognize in some states that'll probably be really hard, depending on what your state funding might look like for early childhood education and care. So that's education. I'm going to take a pause again and see if anyone has any questions. Oh, great. Okay, so I think we are moving on then to equitable access. We're about halfway through the standard. It's our mini boot camp, guys. It's a lot of information and really in detail, nitty-gritty, helps you understand intent and the applications. I hope you're finding it helpful and not too overwhelming. So here for equitable access, we are, our goal is around that local services, both is provided by the local government as well as community partners, are accessible to all residents. So immigrants also provide feedback to address demographic disparities and gaps in services and to improve access to programs, right? That equitable access is not in a vacuum, that programs should be co-created, that we are, designing programs with our immigrant residents, that they are a part of that design process as well. So we're going to hop on over to our document. Oh, yeah, and like I said, this one is not in alphabetical order. Apologies for that. So here we are, 1-star, 1 criteria, a little bit of a break here for those of you thinking about, which, if you're seeking that 1-star, which of those framework areas have more or less criteria. So the first one is that local governments disseminate information on government services, resources, and public benefits with the goal of expanding access to immigrants. So here, again, dissemination of information is expected to occur. It might be to trusted partners who then further disperse that information. And there should be some type of internal strategy about how information is disseminated. And I do have to say for everybody, unfortunately, information on a website with Google Translate is not enough. And so if that is your evidence, it would not be compliant. It has to go beyond translation, machine translation on a website. That's not sufficient for 1 star. So really thinking about, what are those, what is the goal? How are you reaching it, and disseminating that information? It could also be, maybe information is being handed out to some community partners, and like flyers, and information is posted perhaps in some local grocery stores where there's a lot of immigrant residents that utilize that grocery store. It could also be, out at like festivals and fairs, that there's a table and information is being distributed that way. And so just want to, throw out some of those other ideas of how you might be thinking about disseminating that information. Here, moving up to the 2-star on that is that you're communicating through outreach methods that are proven to be effective in reaching immigrant residents. So the 1st star is that, you've set your goal, right? That your goal is to expand access with your information. And now you're really able to demonstrate that, yes, this is effective. We're able to demonstrate that. I don't want to go into the 3 here too heavily around addressing barriers for accessing and navigating healthcare, informing immigrants of workers' rights, and digital inclusion, but recognize that these are all programs. They're not required to be done by the local government, and it could be the nonprofit providing the services. And here for one note around accessing and navigating healthcare, it's often meant through having healthcare centers that have a sliding scale and healthcare providers that speak other languages and are able to access an interpreter. And for digital inclusion, want to recognize that this will likely look very different depending on barriers in your community. So it might be expanding access to Wi-Fi. It might be providing access to a device, or it might be providing some type of digital literacy class. And then for 3.0, for 3-star, so building back on this information piece, that's why it says EA 1.0 in the criteria, because it refers back to that one there. So when we're talking about that information, that's the information we're talking about. And so we have information from the local government is provided in languages other than English. So again, it can't be Google Translate, but is expected to be provided in multiple languages. This also parallels the local government's language access policy, which will be actually covered in our next framework area. For 3.1, accessing immigration legal services. So again, not required to be the local government, and recognizing, not every locality has perhaps an immigration attorney. And so how are those barriers to accessing that representation might be removed. And so, it could be through a partnership program with another organization that might come in to provide a clinic and provide representation that way. Obviously, on like a much broader scale, much higher bar for cities that have a lot of resources, it might be, providing that funding directly, such like an MDocuFund or that type of program for universal representation. And then addressing barriers for immigrants accessing and navigating maternal and infant health care. So again, as a mother, I really appreciate that this is now in the standard. It wasn't in our previous version. But really thinking about, there are a lot of programs out there that are for everybody, and how do we ensure that there's intentionality about ensuring access and removing those barriers that might be specific for immigrant women and children. All right, so moving on up to 4 stars. So as I had mentioned, in education, We saw there was one there specifically for immigrant students, and now we have a more general one in 4-star for removing barriers or addressing barriers for accessing and navigating mental health services. And we have housing here in both 4 and 5-star, so rental housing in 4-star and addressing barriers for home ownership in 5-star. Just want to recognize, that housing is a national crisis, and yet that still looks differently across communities, and that there's the expectation that there's work that's being done to address that crisis, and that work or that barrier that's being addressed is localized. I want to define here local mobility planning efforts for 4.2. This is basically public transportation efforts, but also it might be not necessarily the public transit per se, but also like first and last mile. It could be sidewalks. And so really thinking about, how do people move in your community? And when going through a planning process, ensuring that the needs and priorities of immigrant residents are a part of that as well. And then for 4.3, addressing barriers to immigrants in accessing civil legal services, I want to recognize that, legal aids across the country do have restrictions on who they can serve from federal dollars. And so there is an expectation here that the civil legal services are able to serve everyone, including undocumented individuals or people without status. And so, or status that would be eligible under the legal aid. And so again, finding those alternative programs, perhaps a clinic or other, a university law program to ensure that that the restrictions from perhaps a legal aid are not imposed on everybody, and everyone still has access. All right, so we're moving all the way up to 5-star for equitable access. So here for 5.0, going back to that information from the local government, is proactively written and designed with translation and the diversity of residents in mind. This is, I would say, like a pretty hard criteria to meet. We're thinking about translation and design at the very beginning of creating a document, right? I think oftentimes it's, the document is created in English, and then we say, okay, let's translate it. Okay, now let's think about the pictures that we're going to use for it. Now let's think about the design for it, right? We're thinking about that all at the beginning as part of the early design process. And I've not seen too many places doing that. So expect that one to be a harder criteria to meet. Talked about 5.1 a little bit already. And then this one here, 5.2, working with the state government and or regional transit authorities on expanding access to transportation. So, here in 4.2, we have some of that local mobility planning efforts. Maybe this is more with your local government directly. And now in 5-star, we're engaging that transit authority. That and or is written because of how your regional transit authority might be overseen in different states. And then for 5.3, I just want to say this is written really weirdly. And basically what we're asking here is that there's training for a public defender or district attorney's office or others about how a criminal conviction can impact someone who is a non-citizen. So recognizing that if someone has a plea bargain, that could negatively impact their ability to stay in the United States. Sometimes people are, encouraged to take a plea bargain because it might be lesser time, it might be a less risk, right, than going before a jury, but that plea bargain could actually really greatly impede their ability to stay in the US if they're not a citizen. So I'm going to pause there for equitable access before we move on to government leadership. All right. So government and community leadership, and we have the infrastructure in place to support immigrant participation, inclusion, and equity. Local government and community-based organizations are seeking the feedback to understand the challenges and priorities of immigrant residents. One thing that we did change for this standard, previously this framework area was called government leadership. It's now government and community leadership, because we wanted to recognize that this work is done in partnership with community-based organizations and that the government cannot do this work alone. All right, so this one is all the way at the very beginning of this document. So the first one here, to really begin the work, the foundation we've laid is that there's a staff person in the local government who's tasked with welcoming and immigrant inclusion. Just a few notes about this position. We don't expect a full-time equivalent, or we don't have a full-time equivalent requirement. I think there's some nuance regarding how much the work is institutionalized across other departments, and also size and scale of the local government as well. The work should be internal and external, but again, there's some nuance with this depending on community partners as well. And then the work should be part of a job description. This isn't something that's like, and other duties as assigned, but it might be part of a larger diversity and inclusion portfolio. So perhaps someone's job description is around diversity and inclusion and equity work, and that would be fine to include here. There's a process to ensure regular communication with immigrant residents. So this could be informal. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal process, but the point here is that there is regular and an opportunity for immigrant residents to provide feedback to the local government. And then public libraries. This is the first time also that we're naming the public libraries in this standard, which I think is exciting. They're both here and then another higher star as well. And then we have an immigrant inclusion strategy. I want to note, immigrant inclusion strategy is rather broad. It doesn't necessarily mean, a concrete plan, but really thinking about how the library is supporting this work, what types of activities are they doing, and what type of intentionality do they have in thinking about the immigrant community as well. So for 2-star, the group is really the big lift here for the 2-star. The purpose of the group is to unsilo work across the community. Oh, sorry, I moved on to 2.0. The local government leadership has an immigrant inclusion strategy for its departments and agencies. So again, similar to that immigrant inclusion strategy for the library, the local government also has an immigrant inclusion strategy. Oftentimes this might be, again, a bit more of an informal strategy per se, but it's something that is like clearly seen perhaps in agendas. So it would be something that, if like the city manager brings department heads together, it's on the agenda every so often. They're talking about, how is this happening across departments and agencies? Now we get to talk about the group. For 2.1, 2.2, 0.3, and 0.4. So the goal of the group is to really unsilo the work that's happening in the community. That immigrant inclusion brings together, a lot of different stakeholders, and there's an opportunity to think about different sectors. So it might be healthcare and education and economic development. I think sometimes the framework areas are a really nice way to think about who's participating or what sectors are participating in that group. So we have, a few key items here reflecting the diversity. There's bi-directional communication with the group, being able to provide feedback directly to the local government. So here we would expect, perhaps that staff person that was named in 1.0 to be attending the meetings, but also to ensure that there's opportunity for other departments to be receiving that feedback as well. And then finally, we have local recreational programs, implementing an immigrant inclusion strategy as well. This does not have to be recreational programs through your local government. It could be other programs, perhaps the YMCA, a local summer camp, or other type of recreational programs. Hey, 3-star. This is a big lift. I think government leadership might have a big lift in every single star designation, but they're the ones carrying the certification. So language access is really the big lift here throughout all of 3-star. There is the first one is that local government departments know the demographics of the immigrant population and have access to tools to serve these residents. So, tools being, of course, some language access tools, but perhaps some other ones as well. And then, knowing who they're serving as well, and knowing what those both languages and perhaps some cultural customs are as well. There's a language access policy that includes interpretation and translation protocols for externally facing government departments. So any department that's interacting with the public is expected to follow the language access policy. And that there's training on that language access policy, the requirements, and those resources available. I think sometimes there's a disconnect between policy and implementation, right? That places will have the policy, but then there's staff turnover. People change out of their job. Maybe that they don't receive a whole lot of public, or they don't receive very many people with limited English proficiency. And so they've forgotten, what those steps and procedures are to have language access. And so that there's training there to ensure that implementation occurs. And then the last one for 3-star is that there is some evaluation, and that evaluation is being used to inform the language access needs and usage. And so primarily around this idea about, being able to conduct business in languages other than English, and that feedback is then being used to improve those services, to continue to improve that ability to conduct your everyday business from the local government. I want to mention here also for 3-star in government leadership, it's in 3, 4, and 5-star from now on. We are beginning to assess multiple departments. I don't have them asterisked here, but anytime that it says a local government department in 3, 4, and 5 now, we have the full list of departments listed in the full certified welcoming guide. And we can put a link to that chat in the chat for you. But it would range from child protective services, communications, your code departments, emergency dispatch, fire, human resources, neighborhoods planning, zoning, purchasing, public health, and so on. And that we would be requesting evidence of this work happening in all of those departments, right? So that it would be a pretty heavy evidence collection process to get it from all of those departments. So I just want to flag that for you here when thinking about demonstrating, training or that your departments know the demographics of the immigrant populations. Maybe that's included in your training. And so thinking about, if it's not like a government-wide training, if it is tailored to every single department, you might be having to think about some of that evidence gathering a little bit differently. So for 4-star, it's a community-wide strategy for immigrant inclusion is set through a feedback process, including immigrant and non-immigrant residents. So here, community-wide strategy, community plan. This is the big lift. This is kind of building off of the group being established in 2-star, but now that there's an expectation that that group has created or is creating a community-wide plan for immigrant inclusion. It's not required to be created through that group named in 2-star, but it could be. And the real expectation then is that there's this opportunity for the feedback to go back to the local government as well as to community partners. With this plan, not a plan that sits on the shelf, there's a process to regularly update it. There's the that process, includes feedback from immigrant and non-immigrant residents. And then, as I already said, I kind of skipped ahead, I guess, to 4.2 here, that local government departments then receive that those goals or have the opportunity to ensure that their goal setting is also informed by immigrant and non-immigrant residents. So really thinking about, co-creating a community-wide plan here. So then 5-star, again, referring back to that list of departments, we would expect to see that departments are really thinking about building relationships and trust with immigrant residents. That will look very different depending on what that department is. And I would expect some departments to be more advanced and some to be much, earlier in this stage, probably depending on where they are in this, right? Like your purchasing or procurement office, they might really just be thinking about like gathering lists of businesses and being able to distribute information to immigrant-owned businesses. That might be where they are. And then maybe your Parks and Rec department, they're really thinking about ensuring that their services, that all of their programs that their Rec Youth League offers are culturally appropriate. Perhaps they might even have some community ambassadors or some other types of programs. So a real range, I think, here of what we'll see based on what the department is. Addressing needs and priorities and receiving local government departments have programs that address the needs and priorities of immigrant residents. So addressing the needs and priorities, I think, will come out of these aspects of, right, from 5.0 of having these programs that are building relationships, and also from your community-wide plan, that there is this opportunity to be gathering feedback from community members, and then that the local government is able to use that. Receiving training on working with diverse populations, including immigrants. So again, all of these departments are expected to receive that training. It might be included in that language access training from 3.0, or it might be another separate training, probably really depending on where that department is in their welcoming and immigrant inclusion journey. So with that, want to be really aware of the fact that it says working with diverse populations, including immigrants. We've often received a lot of evidence around, some anti-bias training and some other, cultural competency training, but it's often not really tailored to the local context or really thinking about who are the immigrants in the community. So the expectation is to be really explicit about including immigrants in that training. And then the next one here is around engaging regional jurisdictions, right? So again, at the 5-star level, we should be thinking beyond the local government itself, and opportunities to engage other jurisdictions. So in this case, it might be a county or it might be some suburbs. Been thinking about, when we drive around our communities, and we often cross over into other jurisdictions. And so how can we ensure that these welcoming policies and practices are not isolated? Because we often, when we're driving, don't realize when we're crossing over into another jurisdiction. And so how can we ensure that no matter where we are, what community we're in, that it continues to be a welcoming place? And then the last one here is that the local housing authority implements an immigrant inclusion strategy. And so housing authority being named, sometimes they have been under the local jurisdiction, but typically not. And again, depending on what your state looks like, that work may or will be different for that. So pausing here, and apologies, I got a little bit distracted during this session. We have someone coming to work on our air conditioning, which is great because it's been out since Friday, but apologies, I did get a little distracted as they were walking about the house. But so please let me know if there's anything I can clarify or you have questions about. All right, well, we will move on to safe communities. So we have, some of the goals from this framework area are that policies prevent discrimination, programs are in place to address implicit and structural bias, and community partnerships build trust and identify needs and gaps in services. Bounce over here to our framework area. So first, for 1.0 is that we have a policy here, or program here, programs and policies. Should probably say or. But that there's an emphasis within the local law enforcement agency to build trust and mutual understanding with immigrant communities and immigrant serving organizations. Want to recognize, sometimes that, especially I think for One Star, you might not have as deep relationships in some communities as you're just starting to build this foundation, that building those relationships with an organization first might be that pathway to identifying community leaders and being able to to go deeper with that trust building, relationship building work. Also want to just mention here that the expectation for law enforcement agencies within this framework area is that it's the local law enforcement department that is under the jurisdiction of the local government seeking certification. And so often that will be the police department within a city. I recognize that counties can be different. The sheriff might be elected, but the county executive or commission might still have to approve the budget. And sometimes the county sheriff will be elected, but all of the other personnel are still under the county executive. And so this does vary quite a bit. But if there is basically any type of oversight by the local government seeking certification, then this would apply to them. So in that case where the sheriff is elected, but the budget has to be approved by the county commission, all of this would still apply to them. So just wanted to take a moment to clarify that. And if I can clarify further, if we have any counties on the line that are seeking certification, I'd be happy to take those questions. And then the next one here is really one of our guardrail criteria in the standard, that there's not a policy in place where the primary purpose is to detain or to deport immigrants. So we do look pretty closely at some policy handbooks and have also looked at some contracts as well with the vendors. So just want to name that here and I would be happy to, chat further with anyone that might have a question about that. So for 2-star, we're really now moving from building trust and relationships to thinking more about advocacy and immigrant rights. Typically, a lot of nonprofits will lead the indicators for the Know Your Rights sessions. Law enforcement obviously can be present, but it does not have to be for these criteria to be compliant. So that's for 2.0 and 2.1. And then 2.2, having programs to ensure regular communication with immigrant residents. So this would be the local law enforcement agency having this type of program. So I'm really thinking about community policing here. A lot of local law enforcement agencies have coffee with a cop, which is absolutely fine. But what we would want to see here is that intentionality around reaching immigrant residents. So if they're doing coffee with the cop, is it at an ESL class, for example? And then the last one, connecting immigrant victims and witnesses of crime with community resources. So this is a program. It's not the law enforcement agency that has to be doing this. It certainly could be. But oftentimes what we're seeing is a nonprofit service provider. And it could be this is a very broad criteria. Obviously will really depend on the crime that has occurred. And most of our examples of evidence have been from domestic violence cases. I move on up to 3-star. So here we have a training criteria. This is regular over the course of their career. So regular and over the course of their career. What we're really talking about here is that this is not a training that only happens in the academy when someone first becomes a law enforcement agent or police officer, because most academies have some type of cultural competency training or anti-bias training. And similar to what I had said previously with the other criteria, again, working with diverse residents, including immigrants, we would need to see that for this evidence as well, and that working with immigrants is included on that. Here we have another policy. This is building on that 1-star policy to not detain or deport immigrants. But this is an expectation to clarify in policy the work of the local law enforcement is to not enforce immigration, right? So there's a policy that clarifies that jurisdiction and separation between local law enforcement agencies and the federal immigration enforcement. And then the last one in 3-star 3.2 is that local emergency management agencies have a plan to inform immigrants of community emergencies. And that plan includes the communications methods that are effective in reaching speakers of languages other than English. The plan should be written down and methods of communication should be known. I think what's really important here is this aspect of, including methods of communication that are effective. And I'm still not signed up for my community's text alerts, right? And so what are those ways that we have to communicate with all of our residents, and how do we know that those are effective methods? So that's a really important piece here, and honestly a little difficult. It really requires there to be that trust and relationships built within communities to ensure that we have access to some of those methods and community leaders. One of the things that we saw from Louisville was they used their Welcome Academy graduates as information ambassadors during COVID. And so they had them, they recognized that these were all trusted leaders within the community, and they had them record these videos about the shutdown order. And they continued to have them share information throughout the entire pandemic, which I thought was a really creative way to think about different methods of engaging community members. So here we have, your emergency notification platform. So even though I'm not signed up for my city's text alerts, They are still a really important method of communicating with individuals. And so ensuring that these are available in languages other than English. Should not be Google Translate. And if you don't have this type of technology in your community, I recognize not everybody has, some emergency notification platforms. What are the other notification systems that you're using? This might double up a little bit with that 3-star piece, but there still should be some other methods typically as well. For 4.1, the local government has a process in place to identify the priorities and goals of immigrant residents for creating a safer community. I want to recognize here that safe communities is not about law enforcement, or just about law enforcement. That there's a lot that goes into creating a safe community. It might be the lighting in your neighborhood. It might be your sidewalks. It might be the fact that it's really dangerous to cross the street, right? And so how are there methods or processes in place to identify what those priorities and goals are for immigrant residents? Typically, this does really well align with that government and community leadership 4-star criteria of creating a community-wide plan. And so we just did want to name it very explicitly within the standard because it could be sometimes overlooked. And then moving on to 5-star and wrapping up our session for the day for safe communities. So first we have law enforcement has one or more staff position whose responsibilities include advancing immigrant inclusion. So this typically will be like an immigrant liaison, a refugee liaison type position. And then our last criteria is around publicly sharing data on arrests, jail population, use of deadly force, resident complaints, language access usage, and then disaggregating this data by race, ethnicity, gender, and geography. Just want to recognize language access usage is typically not included in a law enforcement agency's data dashboard. And that's okay. We don't necessarily need to have everything in all one neat little place, but this information should be publicly available without having to really dig it up or having to request a FOIA for it. So wow, we did it. We got through the entire standard. Do you have any questions on safe communities? And Jenny's going to have to hop off. She put her email in the chat. If anyone wants to follow up with her directly, you're welcome to. Right, well, no questions then on safe communities. I hope everybody feels more confident now about understanding the standard. I know it's a lot of information. I know it's really technical. We are happy to answer any questions after you've digested it a little bit more. And I also, want to mention again that we have a quiz, a little pre-assessment. Oh, Maddie already put it in there, just one ahead of me. We have a quiz, a pre-assessment that will help you identify which STAR designation might be best for you. If you're a little bit unsure about that, encourage you to take the quiz. I do want to say though, after looking at some results, I know some of you have already taken it. I think that we miscalibrated the 1-star. And so I'm going to work with our software developers who helped us put it all together in a fancy piece to make it look lovely, and ask them to change it. So feel free to go ahead and take it now, but I will also email everybody that's on this, that has registered for this. We're going to recalibrate the 1-star and see if that might give some people at least the opportunity to answer some of those 2-star questions. Right now it's cutting, you have to go 100% to even move on to 1-star, to move onto 2-star. And I think it's just a little bit miscalibrated because we do allow people another 6 months after their full certification assessment to come back and provide some additional evidence on those pieces where there might be a gap. And so I just want to allow everybody that opportunity. So feel free to take it today. If you get stuck at 1 star, wait about a week. I'll email everybody and we'll send out the link to the quiz again, and you can see if you do better after we've recalibrated the answers for 1 star. So with that, I'd like to know if there's any questions. Oh, I think there's, yep, yes, the copy. So our PowerPoint, I think, Roxana, you might be asking if the presentation will be emailed. Is that what you're asking? Or yes. So the recording will be sent to everybody. We'll include a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation, as well as a link to that Google Sheet again as well. All of that will be included in our email that goes out. Yeah, well, I'm excited to work with all of you on Certified Welcoming. I know Jenny and Madia are as well. So I know Jenny put her email in the chat. And we can wrap up. Yeah, absolutely. Audrey, let me go back. Civic engagement, economic development, and education. So there's civic engagement. And then economic development. And education. Was that good, Audrey, or do you need anything else? Great. Okay, well, you can always reach us at certified@welcomingamerica.org to email, as well as on social media or our website as well. So we look forward to connecting with you for you to apply to Certified Welcoming or for you to get started. So thank you so much for today. And that concludes today's webinar.